What if I told you everything you learned about slavery barely scratches the surface? There's a hidden history that's way bigger, darker, and closer to today than you might have thought.
Hello guys, welcome once again to AfriPost. I hope wherever you are, you're having a great time. Now, we have always seen this issue where in America, history is always not taught as it is. There is a sense in which a lot of true history of whites and even blacks is hidden, and they don't want to teach their kids about the challenges that black people went through, the real true sufferings that whites meted on blacks. This is not taught in schools. However, they are taught about people like George Washington, who are slave owners, and they don't want to really represent the true history as it was. So there is a sense in which falsification of history has happened in America. And I think this is what is disturbing most of black creators. I came across some clips here that were very, very earth-shaking, because for me, I felt like they're revealing a lot of things that need to be exposed. There is this guy who was complaining about the sense in which white children should be allowed to know their own history, regardless of what they are, regardless of how painful they are. They must be taught the true history so that nothing is left hidden. And he was talking quite passionately, and some reactions came through. So I compiled these videos for you. I want us to watch this, then I'll be back where we'll share a lot in the end. Let's watch.
I really wish they would stop hiding history from white kids more than they actually tell white kids that they're better than their history. Because they keep trying to sanitize the history of the United States. And it doesn't make any sense because there's so many plot holes. You're just going to leave this generation of white children confused. And then they ask that real silly question like, what are they supposed to look at and be proud of if we tell the history like it is? And honestly, I think they're looking at it the wrong way, because what I want them to do is to be able to see a Klansman and not see themselves in the Klansman. Some of these folks actually ate people. As a matter of fact, they hung people from trees and then they had a picnic afterward. For example, say your grandfather was abusive towards your grandmother. I don't care how many businesses is in his name. I don't care how many buildings is named after him. Fuck him. He hit granny. And that should be the long and short of history in the United States. White people need to be able to look at history, not relate to them, and be able to say, we are better and we're going to continue to do better. As a matter of fact, we're going to revisit the systems that were set up by this standard, and we're going to correct it as we go along, because this was not right. The George Washington that was in Hamilton is not the same George Washington that owned Mount Vernon in real life. And they try so desperately to blot out names like Malcolm X and certain events that happened, but why don't they ever talk about John Brown? He was a white abolitionist along with Garrett Smith. He was an abolitionist who used one of his estates, I believe, as one of the stations for the Underground Railroad. There are plenty of white, non-racist, non-bigoted historical figures that they could talk about, but they want to spend their time sanitizing the hypocrites. Stop trying to sanitize lynch mobs and slave masters. Let's teach history correctly.
During his lifetime, historian Noel Ignatieff was called one of the 10 most dangerous minds in America. And the reason why he was seen as so dangerous was for his call to abolish the white race. So what did he mean when he said we needed to end whiteness? To start to answer this question, we first have to understand what race and whiteness really is. In 2001, scientists made a revolutionary discovery. During the work of the Human Genome Project to map all of the genes in the human genome, researchers found that race is not real. In other words, racial categories like white and black are not biological or genetic facts, but social constructs. Science has shown that there is no gene common to all white or black people. In fact, there is far more genetic variation within racial groups than between racial groups. This scientific discovery supported what many people have always known, that racial categories were invented by human beings for political and social purposes and have absolutely no basis in biology. Science tells us that race is not real and skin color is simply an evolutionary adaptation. We know that modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, and all humans were originally dark-skinned. White skin didn't appear until much later, around 12,000 to 7,000 years ago. And the white race is an even more recent development in human history. In fact, the idea of white and black racial categories is only a few hundred years old. Historian Nell Irvin Painter argues that there was no notion of race in the ancient world. And scholars like Ibram Kendi argue that race is a product of the 15th century and is directly tied to slavery. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were no white people. There were the British, the French, the Portuguese, Protestants, and Catholics. Before the Atlantic slave trade, there were no black people either. Instead, there were thousands of unique African kingdoms, cultures, civilizations, and religions. It was the Atlantic slave trade that created white and black people. When Europeans began enslaving Africans, they suddenly became one entity, white. And the people they enslaved became one monolithic group too, black. Whiteness meant the freedom to enslave. Blackness was the mark of the slave. By 1751, we can hear Benjamin Franklin discussing this newly created white race. He wrote, "The English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased, and while we are making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light, why should we darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks of increasing the lovely white?" From this essay, we can see that the idea of a white race was only ever defined and discussed in the context of being separate and superior to black people. Whiteness could not exist outside of the context of slavery. That's why you could argue that it's a bit ridiculous to say things like, "I'm proud to be white," or ask, "Why don't we have a White History Month?" Because there is nothing to be proud of or celebrate when it comes to the invention of whiteness. The idea of a white race was invented for only one purpose, to argue that white people are superior to black people and therefore have a right to enslave them. Now, white people can be proud of many things. You can be proud of your family background, your country, your achievements, your morals, your roots. For example, I'm proud of my Irish and Native American heritage. I'm proud of my PhD and my role as a college professor and my political convictions. I'm proud to be a brother, a son, and an uncle. But to simply be proud of whiteness is to be proud of a history of slavery, racism, violence, and evil. To acknowledge these facts has nothing to do with white guilt or white shame. It's simply a recognition of the historical fact that whiteness was invented to justify the exploitation and abuse of people with darker skin. It's a recognition that the idea of whiteness has done more harm than any other idea in human history. On the other hand, black pride is something beautiful, powerful, and necessary. Because whereas whiteness was invented to justify the right to enslave and exploit black people, blackness came to represent the power to resist that abuse and find strength in suffering and adversity. Blackness was about fighting back against racism and discrimination and finding power in unity and solidarity. That's why we can smile when we hear James Brown sing, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." But we should all recoil in horror if we ever heard a white artist sing, "Say it loud, I'm white and I'm proud." As Brown sang in 1968, "Some people say we got a lot of malice, some people say it's a lot of nerve, but I say we won't quit moving until we get what we deserve." Black pride has always been about fighting for their dignity and human rights, which they were denied for centuries. White pride has always been about fighting to strip those rights away from black people and forever treat them as second-class citizens. This is why the historian and activist Noel Ignatieff dedicated his life to a powerful but controversial idea. He argued that if whiteness could be created, it could also be destroyed. And he believed that abolishing whiteness was the only way to ever achieve true racial or social justice in America. Noel Ignatieff was born in Philadelphia in 1940 to a working-class family. In 1958, at the age of 17, he joined the Communist Party and began a long career of Marxist activism. For 20 years, Ignatieff worked in factories where he sought to educate his fellow workers on revolutionary theory and help them organize to fight capitalism. It was during these years that he concluded the greatest ideological barrier to the achievement of proletarian class consciousness, solidarity, and political action is now and has been historically white chauvinism, which he defined as the ideological bulwark of the practice of white supremacy, the general oppression of blacks by whites. Ignatieff declared that for the American working class to unite and overthrow capitalism, white workers had to reject their whiteness and lose their white skin privileges that separate them from the rest of the working class. He argued that white workers had to break away from their white privilege and fight back against the ideology and institution of white supremacy, which provides the illusion of common interest between the exploited white masses and the white ruling class. In the 1980s, when factory jobs began to disappear across the country, Ignatieff decided to go back to school, and he was accepted into the Harvard graduate program, where he began work on his dissertation on the history of race in America. While at Harvard, Ignatieff started a magazine called Race Trader, and their motto was, "Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity." He wrote that the aim of Race Trader is to abolish the white race, which is neither a biological nor a cultural formation, but a social construct, existing only because of the privileges its members enjoy within the state and the legacy of those privileges. When looking for a model of what it would look like to reject whiteness, Ignatieff turned to John Brown, who gave his life in the fight against slavery. In 1995, Ignatieff completed his dissertation, which was published as the book How the Irish Became White. He said he wanted to understand how the Catholic Irish, an oppressed race in Ireland, became part of an oppressing race in America. In the book, he shows how the Irish were not originally accepted into the white race by Americans. The way they became white was by joining in the white supremacist culture of supporting slavery and engaging in violence and discrimination against black people. Even though the book was an academic hit, he always had his critics. Some people interpreted his goal to abolish the white race as a call for violence and extermination, not realizing he was talking about the racist white mindset, not white people themselves. Ignatieff died in 2019 at the age of 78, but his ideas will always be relevant in a society still poisoned by white supremacy and racial discrimination. Years before the Human Genome Project definitively proved that race is not real, Ignatieff knew the greatest truth of all: the only race is the human. During his lifetime of activism and scholarship, many of his friends were pessimistic and believed that America would never change and always be corrupted by its original sin of slavery and its long history of racism. But whenever anyone would begin to despair, Ignatieff would tell them, "If we can just change 5 people's minds, we can change the world." I don't know if I'm that optimistic. I'll take just one.
There's a particular kind of confidence that white culture breeds, a certainty that we are right.
Something rather funny just happened. I was chilling at the top of the volcano behind me because that's what I do. And there was a group of about 5-6 people, 2 of which were white and everybody else seemed to be local and black. The dad, older and white, not from Guadeloupe, was the only one taking up space and talking. And he was talking in statements. He was clearly not very knowledgeable about Guadeloupe. And the people he was with were knowledgeable about Guadeloupe. And yet, he did not ask a single question this whole time. He was talking in statements. The rest of the group was spending their time either confirming or telling him that he was wrong about his statements. But at no point did he have the curiosity to ask the people with the knowledge who were with him to ask questions about the volcano, about the safety of the volcano, about the geography of the place, because clearly they were knowledgeable, because whenever he would make a statement that is wrong, they would stop and correct him. But he could have asked in the first place. At no point did he ask a single question to those people who clearly were more knowledgeable than he was. And that was such a good representation of patriarchy and white ontological expansiveness. We were at the highest point of the island, at the top of an active, living and breathing volcano, a place that should naturally command silence, meditation and awe, even to the most hardened skeptics of us. I was quiet. Most people were quiet because that's what the atmosphere commanded. But he was not. He was loud and he was taking up all of the space. He was filling the space with his statements, never questions. And he was half of the time wrong anyway. At what point the other white man, probably his son, half jokingly said, it's a shame the women are with us, otherwise we would have jumped the barriers and gone over to the forbidden area of the volcano. Everybody was like, well, no, this is forbidden and this is clearly dangerous. And he was like, well, yeah, but I saw a group of people going there. And that's the only time that I intervened in the conversation. But I was like, yes, but those groups, they were with professional guys and they were wearing gas masks, which you're clearly not equipped for. But it's this assumption that, there's a rule, but that's not for us because we're better than everyone else and we're also better than nature. We don't need to follow the rules. It doesn't matter if it's an active volcano because it's us. Surely we're safe, right? That is so typical of patriarchy, maleness, and whiteness. It's the combination of both. When you have been socialized to never have to ask questions because even if you get it wrong, there are no social consequences for you, you never learn to ask questions. You never learn to be curious. You're talking statements. And this is a function of whiteness and of maleness as well.
What if I told you everything you learned about slavery barely scratches the surface? There's a hidden history that's way bigger, darker, and closer to today than you might have thought. Slavery was global and ancient long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic. But what made the Atlantic slave trade so different was how it used race as a weapon and built an entire global economy on stolen lives. It wasn't just people enslaving people. It was a system designed to erase identities, cultures, and humanity itself. And here's the part that most never hear. The majority of enslaved Africans didn't go to the United States. They were shipped to South America and the Caribbean. Brazil alone imported 5 million Africans. The plantations out there were so brutal that you would work yourself to death, and it was cheaper to get a new slave than it was to keep one alive. They didn't just enslave people, they industrialized death. Meanwhile, in places like Britain, where slavery was abolished in 1833, guess who got paid? The slave owners, not those who were enslaved. The British government paid the equivalent of £17 billion to former slaveholders. Taxpayers, including descendants of enslaved people, only finished paying off that debt in 2015. 2015. But here's what they never highlight enough. Enslaved people didn't just suffer, they fought back. From day one, there were uprisings, escapes, secret communities, and entire cultures built on the back of defiance. In Haiti, enslaved Africans didn't just rebel, they won. They defeated France, Britain, and Spain, and founded the first free black republic in 1804. That revolution terrified every slave-owning nation on Earth. Slavery wasn't just some tragic mistake. It was the foundation for modern wealth, global capitalism, and the racial inequalities that we see today. If we don't learn about this hidden history, we don't understand the modern world that we live in today. And this story isn't over. We're still living in its shadow today. Follow if you're ready for the real history, the parts they tried to bury.
Why does a person that never was a slave deserve compensation from a person that never owned a slave?
Bank of America and much of the U.S. financial system were built on the profits from slavery, using enslaved people as loan collateral and even owning them when debts weren't paid. These same institutions, which grew into billion-dollar corporations from the slavery of our ancestors, continue to uphold systems of institutional racism that today prevent Black people from building generational wealth. The horrors of slavery didn't end with emancipation. They left deep scars that still shape the lives of Black people today. This inherited trauma, known as post-traumatic slave syndrome, is rooted in generations of violence, ripped apart families, and stolen identity. It continues to affect mental health, family relationships, and the overall well-being of Black people. The U.S. government has paid reparations to Japanese Americans interned during World War II, and even Americans held hostage in Iran. Yet the only people paid for slavery were the slave owners for losing their slaves after the Civil War. The victims of slavery were never paid. Our ancestors were stolen and endured some of the most violent atrocities in human history. So white people in this country could build their largely unearned generational wealth that they still sit on today, while Black people have been systemically denied the right to build and pass down the wealth we fought hard to earn for generations. Because every single time we did build, for example, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, the whites burned down the entire town and slaughtered every single Black person that they could find. You stole our ancestors. You stole their labor, which made the U.S. an economic superpower. You stole their futures. You dehumanized, brutalized, and traumatized them. Then that generational trauma was passed down to their descendants, who you continue to traumatize and brutalize with your systems of oppression put into place to limit and prevent us from creating generational wealth. And you refuse to dismantle your systems of oppression because that would be admitting that white prosperity was built on Black suffering. But you still owe for the centuries of unspeakable atrocities, because reparations are not charity. It's an unpaid debt that you owe.
Wow, what a revealing discussion there. I think I like how those people have spoken. And there is a sense in which we need to teach our children the true history of our ancestors, where we came from, what we went through, why things happened the way they happened, because it is always said that those who don't learn from history are bound to repeat the mistake that they committed in the past. So for us to have a better future, for people to understand why racism has been entrenched in America, there is need for white kids to be taught the true history so that they know that their ancestors committed sins that are very, very bad against Black people. This is what, for me, I believe is a serious issue that must be looked into in many ways. So, in recent years, a growing number of Black American educators and activists have raised concerns about the way American history is taught in schools, particularly in relation to the role and actions of the white people throughout history. These concerns center around the idea that the dominant historical narrative has long been sanitized or whitewashed to present a more favorable image of white figures and institutions, while downplaying or ignoring the suffering, contributions, and resistance of Black people and other marginalized groups. This misrepresentation, critics argue, foster a distorted view of the past that hinders true understanding, empathy, and progress in addressing systemic racism. One of the most cited examples is the issue in the way slavery is often portrayed in schools' curricula. While some textbooks may briefly acknowledge the horror of slavery, they often fail to emphasize the brutality, dehumanization, and generational trauma it caused. Instead, emphasis has been placed in the benevolence of some slave owners, or the idea that slavery was a necessary evil for economic development. Similarly, the roles of white abolitionists are frequently highlighted more than the courageous efforts of enslaved people who resisted their bondage. This selective focus not only minimizes white culpability, but also denies Black students the opportunity to learn about their ancestors' resilience and resistance. In addition to slavery, the broader historical context of colonization, segregation, and systemic oppression is often glossed over or taught in a way that avoids assigning accountability to white institutions or individuals. Events like the deconstruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, the exploitation of Black labor during the Jim Crow era, or the government's role in redlining and mass incarceration are rarely given the depth of attention they deserve. This lack of comprehensive education reinforces racial ignorance and perpetuates the myth of American exceptionalism, where the darker chapter of history are treated as anomalies rather than an integral part of the national history. Despite calls for reform through movements such as Black Lives Matter and demands for more inclusive curricula, efforts to teach a more accurate and critical history have faced significant resistance. Some state legislatures have passed laws limiting discussions of race and systemic racism in classrooms, claiming they are divisive or make white students feel guilty. This backlash against critical race theory and similar educational frameworks has made it more difficult to address historical truths openly. Critics argue that protecting students from uncomfortable facts only serves to perpetuate ignorance and racial inequality. Ultimately, the push for honest historical education is not about blaming white people individually, but about understanding the structural systems built and maintained through racial injustice. Teaching the full length, including the flaws, failures, and crime committed by white individuals and institutions, foster critical thinking, empathy, and a deeper appreciation for the struggle that shaped the nation. It also helps all students of all races develop a more just and inclusive view of society. Without this shift in how history is taught, the nation risks repeating its past mistakes and missing an opportunity to build a more equitable future. Yes, I guess I agree in many ways about that aspect. Teaching real history is very critical because it helps people avoid mistakes that they made before. And I think it is upon us to really appreciate our past and learn from the mistakes that we did. So the creators who have spoken in the video, I support their view, and I think America must really live up to its call and allow history to be taught as it was. Tell us down in the comment section what you think about this. And if you're watching us for the first time, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and you can also join our membership to get access to exclusive content we have here. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.